It is the seventh day of a momentous struggle. A struggle that pitted North against South, Isaac against Ishmael, and Christ against Muhammad. For almost a week now, these two worlds, peoples, and gods had traded blows in one skirmish after the next. But with winter slowly approaching, the Saracens, though prepared for the cold, weighed down with loot and deep behind enemy lines, finally initiated the climactic engagement. Against them, the northern people stood immobile as a wall and held together like a glacier. They were led neither by a king nor an emperor, but a simple mayor of the Merovingian palace, a towering mustachioed warlord known to history as Charles Martel. He would earn that nickname, meaning the Hammer, on account of the bravery he exhibited on this very battlefield, and the dashing officers or palatini by his side would also go down in myth and history as the paladins of chivalric legend. Yet for all their associations with medieval knights, Charles' men fought more like Roman legionaries, close-ranked, on foot, and in compliance with ancient manuals. In terms of cavalry, it was the Saracens who had the advantage, and as they relentlessly battered the Christian line, the situation began to look quite dire. A lesser force would have broken long ago, but the Franks that Charles commanded were easily the finest warriors born and bred in Europe. During a battle that had taken place the previous century, they fought so hard that in the fighting line there was no room for the slain to fall down. They stood upright in their ranks, corpse supporting corpse, as if they still lived. One might imagine the same was true here at the Battle of Tours. But in the event, the Franks were relieved by their allies, the Aquitanians. Under Duke Otto, who had called Charles to arms, the Aquitanians flanked around their Paynim enemy and breached their loot-filled camp. When word of the assault reached the Saracens, they hurried back to defend their troves of treasure, giving the Franks the perfect opportunity to counterattack. According to the Mozarabic Chronicle, the Christians, with their strong mighty limbs and harsh iron hand, found the emir and killed him by striking him in the chest. By nightfall, the demoralized Saracens settled back into their camp, and the fighting drew to a close. The next day, it would continue, or so the Franks and their allies believed. But rising from their camp at daybreak, as the Chronicle memorably put it, the Europeans looked at the ordered tents and tabernacles where the enemy camp had been placed and found them empty. They then divided the spoils and collectibles and returned to their own lands. When those events were recorded in 754, they marked the first time the word European found its way into a Latin chronicle. It would be quite some time before the name caught on, and even longer before it came to encompass all the peoples and places of today's Europe. But there in its birth throes, right beside the Franks and Aquitanians, are the too often forgotten people of Burgundy. Just as they had quietly played their role in 451 in the decisive battle of late antiquity, they did so again in 732 at one of the best recollected battles of the Dark Ages. Not only that, it is in part because of another chronicler, a chronicler of Burgundian origin, that this battle is still remembered today. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, I need to give a big thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Aura. With Aura, traveling the web will feel as safe and seamless as the ancient Roman roads still favored by medieval Burgundians. Its guarantee, telling you exactly which Saracens, Vikings, or brigands have your digital data and automatically submitting opt-out requests on your behalf. Just last year, the data broker National Public Data was breached, exposing 2.9 billion records. This included our most sensitive data, social security numbers, addresses, phone numbers, All of them were released for whoever wanted them. Even worse, this information was released for free. But with Aura, I don't have to worry about my records being among those 2.9 billion. I can rest easy knowing my data is secure. If, like me, you value your privacy, you can go to the link in the video description, aura.com/empirebuilders, to start your 2-week trial today. And now, back to the video. With the fall of their kingdom in 534, the Burgundians came under the rule of their Germanic cousins, the Franks, then ruled by the sons of Merovech. Over the course of the next 2 centuries, the northern peoples, that is to say the Franks, Aquitanians, the Burgundians, and others, watched as their Merovingian masters transmogrified from the all-powerful line of Clovis to the toothless Rolf-Anillon. Throughout this time, the Burgundians governed themselves with a law code of their own devising, the Lex Burgundionum compiled in the time of King Gundobad. Perhaps for this reason, they continued to be conscious of their Burgundian identity well after the fall of the Nibelung kings. Due to the union between Clovis and Clotilda, they could also take pride in the knowledge that each of their Merovingian suzerains descended from a Nibelung bride. And not just any bride, but the very one who converted her husband, and thus the Franks as a whole, to the Nicene Creed of Christianity, thereby providing for the advent of Catholicism. Besides this, the most significant Burgundian contribution to the realm of the Franks came in the form of record-keeping. Thanks to the extensive annals found in Burgundian churches, the Chronicle and continuations of Fredegar were compiled in the 7th and 8th centuries. Together, these sources constitute most of what we know about the Franks after 591, when the lively account of Gregory of Tours reaches its conclusion. Though this Burgundian hand or succession of hands was not as skillful as Gregory's, it did leave us with a few memorable passages, and, more to the point, it smoothed the transition from the Merovingian period to the Carolingian one. By the time of Charles Martel, the real power among the Franks lay in the hands of the palace mayor, even more so following his victory at Tours. But in order for the Carolingians to assume the crown in their own right, they were still in need of legitimacy, the likes of which the continuations of Fredegar went some way toward providing. Toward that end, it was Charles Martel's half-brother who commissioned the work, and based on its description of what took place at Tours, the influence of its patron is rather hard to miss. Taking boldness as his counselor, Prince Charles set the battle in array against the Saracens and came upon them like a mighty man of war. With Christ's help, he overran their tents, following hard after them to grind them small in their overthrow, and scattering them like stubble before the fury of his onslaught. Curiously, given the author's likely origins, the Chronicle also makes a point of Charles' struggles in Burgundy. On multiple occasions, we are told he had to bring an army to the region, curbing rebellious sentiments here, uprooting traces of paganism there, and all the while appointing officials expressly loyal to him. Clearly, not everyone in Burgundy was as keen as our chronicler to collaborate with the Frankish regime, but in the event, this subjugated people had little choice. By 751, Charles' son Pepin the Short assumed the crown after deposing and tonsuring the last do-nothing Merovingian king. Not quite 50 years later, Pepin's son Charlemagne, the most famous Carolingian by far, was crowned in Rome and hailed as emperor. The realm then passed to Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious, under whose reign the Franks and Burgundians welcomed a familiar visitor. In 837, the same comet their ancestors had sighted shortly before the Battle of the Mariatian Fields strayed as close as 2.8 million miles from the surface of the Earth, a mere 0.03 astronomical units. The appearance of this fiery spectacle sent Louis the Pious into one of his gloomy reveries. By this token, the second Carolingian emperor prophesied, a change in the realm and the death of a prince are made known. On both counts, the stars proved Louis correct. Within 3 years, the emperor was dead. Within 6, his empire, or rather the empire of his father, divided as part of the Treaty of Verdun. By that point, Gundobad's law code had gradually been abandoned, and the name Burgundy almost abandoned with it. It was only with the aforementioned treaty, the so-called Birth Certificate of Europe, that Burgundy would return, a house divided, but one still standing. What had once been the southern and eastern bulwark of the old Kingdom of Gunther was now a part of Lotharingia, and this included the fragment later to be known as the Free County of Burgundy, or Franche Comté. Lotharingia itself later disappeared from the map, giving way to Upper and Lower Burgundy, then the Kingdom of Aros-Burgundy, and finally dissolving under the Holy Roman Empire. Meanwhile, west of the Saône, the area corresponding to Dijon, Mâcon, and Nevers, became a part of West Francia, eventually to give way to the Kingdom of France. It is there that our story now takes us. The dust had hardly settled on the Saracen incursions of the 8th century before a new threat, a northerly threat, emerged on the Atlantic horizon. Clinging to old gods and old ways aboard their new seafaring longships, the Vikings struck the newly minted civilization of Europe like a bolt from the blue. With their dreaded vessels' slender shapes and shallow drafts, they penetrated deep into the continental interior by way of the Seine, the Rhine, and the Meuse, leaving seas, rivers, bays, and creeks blood red in their wake. It was as though these arteries infected the heart of Europe with some long-buried pathogen of old Germanic furor, now thawed into re-existence and raging again as in the days of Merovech. Of all the Carolingian successor states, these Viking raids disproportionately targeted West Francia, a fact which did not bode well for Burgundy. With its burgeoning network of monasteries, this river-fed region was too good to pass up for any heathen passerbys. As they sailed down the Aube, the Loire, and the Yonne, these Vikings not only threatened a valuable store of the kingdom's wealth, but the storehouse of Frankian memory itself, sparing neither relics, nor donatives, nor annals from their fiery wrath. Eventually, the warrior Count of Uton was charged to defend the region from Viking raids, and because of his victories against this dreadful foe, he went down in history as Richard the Justicar. Thanks to him, Burgundian monasteries not only survived, they thrived, becoming bastions of spiritual and temporal repose for monks and relics far and wide. Yet the Justicar did not stop there. In 911, he defeated the fearsome Viking Rollo the Walker and lifted the siege of Chartres, affecting an outcome which in time reverberated on the southern seacoast of England. That is because Rollo's reversal led to a change in his cold and pagan heart, prompting the Sea Lord to convert to Christianity and lay down roots in West Francia. A century and a half later, Rollo's great-great-grandson invaded England and triumphed at the Battle of Hastings, becoming known to future generations as William the Conqueror. But that is a story for another time. For now, we return to the Justicar and those that would succeed him. In honor of his victories against the Vikings, Richard was given the Duchy of Burgundy, choosing for his capital the ancient city of Dijon. There, at that crossroads between Lyon and Paris, inside of which Clovis and Gundobad had once passed with their armies, Richard ruled as Duke until 921. His son Rudolf did one better, elected King of West Francia in 923, only to die without an heir and let the throne revert to a descendant of Charlemagne. 3 brief generations of Carolingians followed before West Francia was ruled by a new family, that of Hugh Capet, who could, in any case, also trace his heritage back to the grandfather of Europe. In the 11th century, the Capetians themselves took the reins of Burgundy, and in 1032, the ducal title passed to Hugh's grandson Robert the Headstrong. Though unsuccessful in his bid for the throne of France, Robert founded the Capetian cadet branch known as the House of Burgundy. Under him and his successors, the Burgundians would again enjoy their anointed place in the sun. Not far from virgin forests where rabbits, martens, wild boars, lynxes, and bears roam free, if they hadn't already been slaughtered during the tedious hunting parties organized by local potentates, lay the idyllic village of Cluny, which, aside from its hunting lodge, wooden chapel, and a few shabby vineyards, had nothing to recommend it. This Burgundian hamlet, with its paradisiacal sweetness, was the ideal place to accommodate a new monastery. The hunters would have to satisfy their cravings elsewhere. The yelping of the hounds was replaced by the praying of monks. The new Benedictine abbey was consecrated on the 11th of September, 910, as an independent institution. By the middle of the 11th century, it had grown into the center of a religious network that numbered 1,500 monasteries, one of the first multinationals in history. So wrote Bart van Loo, who, in addition to being one of the most colorful historians of the 21st century, has done more to keep the memory of Burgundy alive than almost anyone around today. His task has greatly been aided by the Burgundians themselves. With half a dozen bishoprics and scores of monasteries, nunneries, and canon houses, this duchy contained one of the biggest archives in the medieval world. Not only that, the Burgundian Abbey of Cluny was, as we heard from Van Loo, at the very beating heart of a major religious reform movement. It was known after its abbey as the Cluniac Reforms, which accomplished for monks what the Gregorian Reforms would soon accomplish for popes. Both of these movements opposed secular interference within their respective domains and acted in concert to establish the church as a viable check on secular power. Together, these reformers promoted priestly celibacy, expanded the properties and titles of the church, and brought to an end the cycle of blood feuds known to us as Feihitha. Such a Germanic way of thinking had less and less room in this ever-expanding Christian world, a world with peace movements and monastic orders on one side, and armed pilgrimages and knightly orders on the other. At the forefront of these methods to balance the medieval tempers sat the Capetian Duchy of Burgundy, so that by the 12th century it was, in the words of one scholar, if not the political heart of medieval France, certainly the spiritual. Perhaps the most famous of the Cluniac reformers was Saint Hugh the Great, whose ascetic lifestyle was remarkable for two separate reasons. The first because he came from one of the noblest families in Burgundy, and the second because in his day the church had grown quite rich. That is to say, unlike Hugh, who habitually slept on a straw bed, more and more of his Benedictine brothers were sleeping on feather beds with ornamented canopies. And so it was that only 60 miles away from Cluny, there sprouted a parallel line of Christian thought and development. In 1098, the Abbey of Cîteaux was founded by a breakaway group of Benedictine monks, the start of another grand Burgundian enterprise. This time it was in the swampy, wooded environs south of the city of Dijon, a monastic site that eventually produced Saint Bernard, the founder of the Abbey of Clairvaux. Like Hugh of Cluny, Bernard came from the upper crust of Burgundian society and renounced life's finer things in pursuit of prayer and privation. The example Bernard provided would form the basis of a new monastic order, the Cistercians. They were the yin to the Benedictine yang, wearing white instead of black, building chapels instead of cathedrals, and characterized most of all by poverty instead of wealth. But then the Cistercians also got wealthy, a product of their own success in stewardship and agriculture. In particular, this sacred fraternity got really good at making wine. Quoting once more from Bart van Loo, in 1110 the monks planted the first grapevines on the stony subsoil of a nearby slope. The Cistercians continued to plant their vines until thousands of acres were put into service. Gradually, they improved their production methods, which had made little progress since the arrival of the Romans. It was a labor-intensive enterprise, but was in time something that the monks had in abundance? Yes, it was, and evidently the monks put every minute of that time to good use. More than anywhere else in the High Middle Ages, the art and science of viniculture was perfected in their monasteries, so much so that they eventually became the largest producers in all of Europe. They developed the techniques of trellising and leaf thinning, and they understood the concept of terroir, that is, how the quality of the land, the soil, the climate, the slope, affect the taste of the grape. They built stone enclosures to protect their vines from the animals and the wind, and the term for this walled vineyard, or clos, appears in the name of many vintages today. In the Golden Slopes, they built the Clos de Vougeot in the 12th century, still among the oldest and most famous vineyards in the world. Meanwhile, the Chardonnay they pioneered in the region of Chablis is one of the most popular varieties of vintage still enjoyed today. The 13th century was a quieter one for Burgundy. Mostly it consisted of consolidation. Already in the previous century, the Dukes of Burgundy were on the offensive, joining the armed pilgrimages that ranged from Jerusalem to Cordoba. In 1204, a Burgundian contingent was present for the most treacherous of these expeditions, taking part in the legalized sack of the great city of Constantinople. With the collapse of Byzantine hegemony, Duke Hugh IV purchased the empty privilege of calling himself the King of Thessalonica. In truth, he was still fighting to be the Duke of Burgundy. In fairness to him and his predecessors, they ruled a duchy ribbon between Vieux Riche lordlings, Cluniac reformers, and Nouveau Riche Cistercians. Though gradually the Capetians did reclaim a number of Burgundian lands and titles, with the death of each duke, these were divided between his surviving sons. That had been the way of things since the days of Gunther. It was only with the fortuitously named Robert II that this self-defeating practice finally came to an end. In 1306, Robert's eldest son Hugh inherited all of his father's lands and titles, his brothers having to make do merely with annual allowances. Around this time, the comet reappeared in vivid detail. One chronicler wrote that it left behind great trails of fumes, the sight of which served as inspiration for Giotto di Bondoni's Star of Bethlehem. According to art historian Roberta Olsen, this was the most accurate rendering of the comet until the 19th century, which goes some way toward explaining why the robot sent to study the comet in 1986 was named Giotto. As to what the Burgundians had to say about the comet of 1301, we are left in the dark. No doubt there were those who thought it an omen of evil times, and on this particular occasion, the forecast proved correct. The 14th century proceeded in stark contrast to the previous one, almost defying belief with its multiplicity of crises, calamities, and catastrophes. This was the time of plague, rebellion, brigandage, and bloodshed. The time of the Black Death, the Jacquerie, the Routier, and the 100 Years' War. In other words, it wasn't a good time to be in France or Burgundy. The century began with the Battle of the Golden Spurs, pitting French knight against Flemish peasant in the torrid summer of 1302. As the annals of Ghent record, the flower of knighthood with horses and chargers of the finest fell before weavers, fullers, and the common folk, and foot soldiers of Flanders. The beauty and strength of that great French army was turned into a dung pit. Amid the dung and the worms, the victorious Flemish rebels went panning for gold, securing 500 pairs of gleaming spurs, for which the battle is named. It was an upset unlike any experienced in all the generations of France's paladins. But though Charles Martel might have been spinning in his grave, this was only the beginning. In 1337, the 100 Years' War broke out between the quarreling sister kingdoms of England and France. By then, the direct Capetian line had died out, and the French throne was occupied by Philip VI, first Valois monarch. Yet the closest male relative of the last Capetian king wasn't Philip, but England's Edward III. Still, the two might have lived in peace and harmony had it not been for lingering disputes over the English occupation of Gascony and the French alliance with Scotland. In 1346, Edward and his son, the Black Prince, handed France its worst defeat at the Battle of Crécy. Then followed a truce, the outbreak of plague, and in 1356 the Battle of Poitiers, where the English won another great victory and captured King John of France. In 1360, after 20 years of fighting, the Edwardian phase of the 100 Years' War was finally over. In exchange for expanding his holdings in Aquitaine, Edward III lowered the price of John's ransom and renounced his claim on the crown of France. Though the treaty did not represent the worst outcome imaginable, had you talked to someone from Paris or Dijon, they would tell you that the end was nigh. They would tell you that the four horsemen of the apocalypse, death, famine, war, and conquest, had made France their stable. That hysteria, chaos, rebellion, and lawlessness might as well be called their grooms. Large bands of highwaymen or routiers now roamed the country unchecked, uniting for the worst reasons Frenchmen, Englishmen, and Germans, ex-mercenaries, corrupted paladins, and run-of-the-mill thieves. As Bart van Loo writes, the mainly agrarian Burgundy, with its flourishing wine culture, was one of the regions most infested by bandits and mercenaries. Going on a journey without an armed escort became a suicidal venture. The situation in the cities was hardly better, contaminated, yes, with the Yersinia pestis, but also with the germ of the Third Estate. About 35 years after the Battle of the Golden Spurs, the textile entrepreneur Jacob van Artevelde made his first foray into public life. After throwing his lot in with the English, the so-called Brewer of Ghent fermented another Flemish rebellion. This was a new and potent force in late medieval politics, for all intents and purposes a dictator drunk on the power of the mob. The hangover came in 1345. That same year, the people of Ghent broke into the brewer's home, chased him to his stable, and cheered as the town cobbler lopped his head off with an axe. In 1357, another rabble-rouser emerged in the form of Etienne Marcel, who was serving as the provost of Parisian merchants. His movement was based in the heart of France, and in the event, he would not get very far. Within a year, Etienne was assassinated and his uprising crushed by the Dauphin Charles. Yet that was precisely when a new revolt, the most famous of all, broke out in the north, led by a well-to-do farmer called Jacques Bonhomme, or Jack Goodfellow. In actual fact, the man's name was Guillaume Calle. The reason he was called Jacques is because that was the name for the padded gambesons worn by the peasant class. It is from Jacques that we get the term Jacquerie, now a byword for any communal uprising. Though the revolt was a brief one, it was, in the words of Robert Gottfried, one of the bitterest and bloodiest in French history. One need only look at the Chronicle of Jean Labelle to confirm as much. I dare not write the horrible deeds that the Jacques did to ladies and damsels, Labelle wrote, before doing just that. Among others, they slew a knight and then put him on a spit and roasted him at the fire in sight of the lady, his wife, and children. Then they made her eat of her husband, and after made her die an evil death with all her children. Eventually, the Jacquerie was crushed by the power of the First Estate, by Charles of Navarre, and once again by Charles the Dauphin. In the final count, this was still an age of kings and lords, but even they were not safe from the defining crisis of this age. It is now thought the Black Death swept away as many as 50 million people, or about half of Europe's population. The sheer totality of the catastrophe helps explain the cult of death that emerged in its wake. The self-flagellating bands of penitents who wandered the country, half-starved, half-naked, and half-alive, forming together a kind of funerary procession, but equally a dress rehearsal for the unborn Renaissance generation. In the words of one scholar, the cult of death was to reach its height in the 15th century, but its source was in the 14th. When death was to be met any day around any corner, it might have been expected to become banal. Instead, it exerted a ghoulish fascination. Emphasis was on worms and putrefaction and gruesome physical details, where formerly the dominant idea of death was the spiritual journey of the soul. Now the rotting of the body seemed more significant. It was against this backdrop that Philip of Rouvre, the last Capetian Duke of Burgundy, wasted away in the land of blood and wine. As the inimitable Bart van Loo described it, while Roman criminals sucked the Burgundian region dry, a malicious illness was wearing away the young duke's vitality. The swellings in his armpits left no doubt. After 12 years' absence, the plague had returned. For 10 days, fever, hematomas, boils, and black spots heralded the death agonies to come. The Duke died on the 21st of November, 1361. With Philip's death and his burial in the Abbey of Citeaux, Burgundy passed to the House of Valois, a familiar story on the surface of things. Once more was this land ruled by the minor branch of a royal family, one that could, as it happens, also trace its lineage back to Hugh Capet. Yet it was under this family and no other that Burgundy reached unparalleled heights, crossing the threshold to the modern era and capturing the European imagination. Under the Grand Dukes of the West, the foundations for an empire were laid, slowly and methodically, from one generation to the next. Which now leaves us with the question, who was it that laid the first stone? Thanks for watching the first chapter of this 6 or 7 part series on the Burgundians. Get early, exclusive, and ad-free content by signing up on Patreon, like these wonderful empire builders on screen. Lastly, if you're concerned about your digital security, be sure to check out Aura by clicking the link in the video description or pinned comment.